I am recording this meeting. So, hooray, thank you all for joining us. We've got 20 participants today. This is awesome. We've got a relatively full agenda, and I see some friendly faces, so it's great to have you all here. First up on our agenda today was Paul Brown from Salesforce, and they're just getting involved with the community, so I figured I'd ask them to talk about what they're interested in. Well, ask Paul to talk about what Salesforce is interested in.
Right. Well, and thank you. Should I just launch in?
Go for it.
Okay, cool. So I have to put a disclaimer on here, which is I work at Salesforce.com, but I don't speak for them.
Yes. Wow, craziness. I'm a stranger.
Yeah, that's a 7-hour drive. I've done a 7-hour drive as recently as.
Alex, can you mute?
I did the last.
Thank you.
Okay, cool.
We had Brendan from the neighborhood.
Yeah, actually speaking for Salesforce is kind of a big deal, and you have to get PR certified, and I'm going to really try to avoid that. So I will speak in more general terms, and so from a tactical perspective, Kubernetes seems like a great tool, right? You've got a consistent engineering experience from development through integration testing onto internal data centers or public cloud. Got well-factored layers that make a lot of things work right? It's clear that this was put together by people who are interested in similar use cases. Autonomous and dynamic in sensible ways, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the second slide that I had there. And then, performs well at a reasonable scale. So for the kinds of things, at least that my team has in mind, hundreds of nodes is enough, and low overhead for networking is particularly important because we're moving large volumes of data. And one of the other wins for Kubernetes from particularly from a development perspective is that the sort of spaghetti on your box for the kinds of use cases that we're considering is really an awful experience. It's bad enough to run something like Spark or Storm, but to actually pull up a full cluster plus additional systems is a giant pain in the rear. And then I'm, by the way, very happy to have questions or stones thrown or anything else. So, one and hopefully, yeah, there you go. Hopefully, the use of the case for use case is not like just so played out for you guys at this point that it's tiresome, but indulge me. So the use case I'd like to highlight. Is one of creating an idiomatic, opinionated operation for stream processing. So one that we care about very much, and one that I think plays to Kubernetes strengths, and one that may have some interesting motivational or foundational questions. So the baseline set of requirements, which may or may not be familiar with, but probably if you've worked outside of Google or outside of Amazon on systems like this, are a bunch of open source components. You've got Zookeeper, Kafka, Spark, and these all have their own set of operational expectations, right? Zookeeper, 3, 5, et cetera. You've got a set of nodes that need to communicate with each other. Kafka, you've got a set of nodes that need to communicate with each other. And Zookeeper, Spark, you've got a master and a bunch of workers. They're no longer called slaves. And you could also have Storm or Flink or Samza, which is the LinkedIn version of the name that runs atop LinkedIn, or something more bare metal like reactive Java. And these all have kind of interactions and different behaviors. Now, On top of that, things that aren't necessarily in the scope of Kubernetes but are interesting is that you've got multiple interlocking layers of lifecycle. Right? You've got the underlying cluster. We've got the spin up and start up for the various pieces that who wants what when to feel like they're healthy and not kind of do the turtle thing of lying on their back with their legs waving in the air. You've got actual application code, and then you've got backing data, right? So things like disaggregated storage, Ceph, S3, Azure Block Store, HDFS are all, of interest to us, and both within and without the lifecycle of a Kubernetes cluster, right? Some data you may want to survive, and some you don't care about so much. And then there are also, mixed in there multiple levers for resiliency and placement. We don't want to have two of the Zookeeper nodes attached to a physical node or two physical nodes that are behind the same power distribution unit, ... And this goes on up the stack to brokers, leaders for partitions, and Spark and or Storm. And with that, I'll maybe ask if there are questions or comments from folks on the quote-unquote phone who thought about similar things, or I have part of my team here in the room with me. We can take questions or make comments.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I know we spent a fair bit of time kind of starting with the community version of Cassandra for Kubernetes, and had to kind of tweak it and tune it to make it a little bit more fully baked. My impression is that the Spark, the sort of standard community Kubernetes packaging of Spark, is in sort of a similar state, which is that there's kind of a good start there, but it isn't probably fully baked for wide scale production use. Can you comment on whether you use that or built your own, and what you think the state of, I'll say Spark, I mean, probably these other systems are of interest as well with regards to, did you start with community versions? Did you build your own? How did you manage all that?
So, well, in general, consuming open source is something that is, best done in full collaboration with the community. So we're to the extent that we can, we're trying to use the most recently released versions. We're trying to work with the head of active development branches, and you guys can hit me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're just packaging up Spark based on what is directly available from Apache and not using anyone else's Kubernetes packaged version of it. In part, I think part of the perspective there is that, at least from a top level view, we're presuming that it's going to make more sense for us to manage Kubernetes clusters containing Spark rather than attempt to manage Spark across something like a larger Mesos cluster that's shared between multiple Kubernetes clusters. Right, so we're breaking our hierarchy down maybe a little differently than people might if they already had a Mesos infrastructure. And maybe that makes sense from other things that you've seen people do or not.
So I agree with that general perspective entirely, and that's the same direction we're headed. My real question was, there is in the Kubernetes project packaging efforts around a bunch of these systems, and the question was, are you using those, and how's it been, and are you contributing back on those, and any perspective on that? If you did your own packaging, just started straight from the Apache side, then that's a different answer. I'd say I'd really encourage you to start with the Kubernetes project version of those and help us improve them.
Okay, well, yeah, and I think there is, not by me at the moment, but by other people here in the room, there is now frantic Googling. Apologize for using your company name as a verb. You're welcome to Salesforce. I
I'd be happy to talk with you offline about it as well, too.
Yeah. Find the right place to engage, and some of and getting to spend a little more time with Sarah later is finding out how to be more first-class citizens here.
Right. And in case you didn't notice, Tim was just noting that the Big Data Sig is working on some of the stuff directly, so it'd be another great place for you to engage.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we'll come plug in.
Yeah, I just want to say how much we appreciate the work. Certainly, this is a workload that we hear a lot of, that people want to run against Kubernetes, so we're really excited to have someone. Let's definitely just sync offline. I actually just spoke to Zach, who's about 10 meters from me right now, about the state of productionness of the Spark example. He reported that he has a big data background, and he said it was in pretty good shape, but he definitely hadn't done load testing against it. That's not to say we don't want to use what you're doing. What I would say is let's just merge efforts so that we have multiple folks working against one solution.
Oh yeah, well, and I really do mean I didn't bold it or anything else, but we're the opinionated unit of operation, I think, is something that we feel very strongly about. We don't want to wrap things. We don't want to, obscure or otherwise sort of deface them in presenting them to our users and, for our own purposes. We need these things to be exposed in their own right and then just well integrated into the rest of the ecosystem, right? And that's, I think, what's best for everybody.
So let me also frame this, Paul, since you're new to this community. David Aramchik was just talking to you about Zach, and he's the product manager internally here at Google who focuses on GKE and Kubernetes. And a moment ago, Bob Wise at Samsung, I think you know Bob, so maybe you recognized his voice. He was the one that reminded us about the Big Data Sig and the packaged, the beginning of the packaging work.
Cool, awesome. Super great to meet you guys both, and the varieties of possible public cloud deployments are things we're interested in too. And we didn't try GKE yet. That's easy.
Okay, if you guys are not on mute, please go to mute because we're getting a lot of background noise again.
Kind of awesome compression artifacts and what. But yeah, we're actively fiddling with Azure and AWS, and GKE is next, but because that's already sort of so well done, we figured it would be cheating to start with it.
Not cheating, practical.
I'm not opposed to cheating.
Okay, well, cool, thanks. Any other questions for Paul or people who want to recommend that he and his team look at their SIG or reach out directly?
Hey, Paul, this is Joseph Jacks. I actually had some conversations with the folks over at Confluent about Kafka and some upstream issues in Kafka preventing their queues and brokers from running properly in containers. And there's a Jira issue I think I can point you to once I get that from them. But otherwise, they're actually super interested in this and finding like real users to point to as examples of people running Kafka on Kubernetes. So that I'd be really interested in following what you're doing there. Okay, cool. Well, and we're going to share one. By the way, one really interesting thing. If any of you guys are following SAMSA, is there was one guy, and it's probably a month back or so, on the SAMSA mailing list who actually broke out the Yarn pieces and replaced them with Kubernetes for work management. And that's cool. Yeah, that might be a really interesting thing to play with too. But yeah, would love a pointer to that Jira. Sounds good.
Awesome. So I'm going to make a request for someone to take notes. Unfortunately, I'll have to sit and chat with Paul to get some summary notes from him later because we didn't have a note taker during that section. So can I get somebody to volunteer and do some note taking for us? Come on, hand raisers. I see a lot of you in the document. Okay. I don't have a hand raiser. I'll do my best to take some of the notes, and then who have given presentations to write summaries otherwise. So next on our agenda was the Sig Config update, and I believe that that was going to be Jack and Brian. So one of Jack or Brian, are you guys around? All right, well, we'll jump.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm actually here. Sorry, I'm sharing with Quentin. I had trouble connecting, actually. I'll figure it out later. Yeah, so the config SIG has been meeting for the past several weeks. The meetings are on Wednesday, 1 p.m. Pacific time, usually. There's also a Google group and Slack channel to reach out, covering topics for application deployment and configuration, not deployment of Kubernetes itself. That's something that oftentimes surprises people. But so the topic of the last several meetings has been reuse of configuration, specifically parameterization of configuration. If you want to reuse a configured set of YAML files describing Kubernetes resources or something that describes how to deploy an application, like replication controller into service as a canonical example. And you want to share that with others, and you want to reuse it or instantiate it multiple times in multiple clusters or whatever. There are a few common needs. One is scoping, just so you can create the objects with names and label selectors and so on that don't collide or overlap. And that is addressed reasonably well by cluster and namespace scoping. But another common need is slight customization. So, plugging in your database password or changing the amount of CPU or RAM that a particular instance needs, things like that. So we've been discussing, there have been a few proposals for configuration parameterization. There's one, OpenShift actually which is built on Kubernetes, actually has a mechanism called templates for this, which is basically a list of objects which have some values of some fields parameterized and a list of parameters that need to be provided to instantiate that list of objects. So there's a proposal to slightly simplify that and upstream it. And there was another proposal for doing substitution in kube control, and I guess there was a third position, which was to do nothing in Kubernetes and just pre-process the files outside of Kubernetes, which is what people have done so far, either with very simple tools like sed or Perl or awk or whatever, or with something more sophisticated like make and JSON it or Python or Jinja or what have you to just pre-process the files, or even a full configuration and reconciliation system like Deployment Manager, which is also available and works with Kubernetes. So the position that was reached is we actually have a number of use cases in Kubernetes where we need some very simple parameterization programmatically. For example, there's a number of proposals outstanding. One is for something, the working name is PetSet, formerly called nominal services, to create a number of slightly parameterized instances of some kind of stateful service where each individual needs to have a stable identity, like to run a database or a key value store, queuing system or the like. There's also a workflow proposal. There's a scheduled job or cron, distributed cron style proposal. And all these proposals, they need to create multiple objects, not just pods, For example, in the database case, you need to typically create a pod and a persistent volume claim together. And the persistent volume claim needs to persist and be stable, and the identity of the pod needs to be matched to the identity of that persistent volume claim. You may also need to create secrets or other Kubernetes objects together with those pods. Similarly, for a scheduled job, you may need to create, we have this new job API, so in simple cases, you just create one job, but you might also need to create several jobs or a sequence of jobs, or you may need to create secrets together with the jobs or whatever. Similar for workflow, you need to create a sequence of jobs, and they need to be parameterized in some way. Like in the cron case, they may need to be parameterized by time. In the pet case, they may need to be parameterized by index, or they may have different command line arguments to each instance. Like one might be the master and others might be slaves or whatever. So for these cases where controllers, or even simple cases where we need to parameterize from the UI or from kube control to just be able to create kind of a canned set of objects with slight variation, we decided a very limited, simple template mechanism does make sense. And because it needs to be accessible from all these different components, it needs to have an API, not just be in the client. At the same time, we do want to support these more sophisticated substitution and expansion approaches, configuration DSLs and the like Jinja, JSON at full Python, and so on. So we agreed that those would be implemented outside the system as they are now, but we have this new third-party resource under development that will allow them to store state in Kubernetes and its key value store. So if they need to store their configuration objects, the not preprocessed objects or other state, they could use that third-party resource to do so. So that is likely a route that some of the systems will take. So the configuration space is very large, and different people have different kinds of approaches they want to use depending on where they come from. Like some people might want to use Compose and then Compose to Kube, translate it to Kubernetes resources, or other people might want to use Terraform, or other people might want to use JSON or whatever. We want to ensure that functionality built for Kubernetes targets the right level of abstraction. So things like rolling update works on concrete Kubernetes API resources. So regardless of how you generate those resources, you can use rolling update. There's a new proposal to automatically generate secrets. That was originally tied to the template proposal I mentioned earlier, but we decided to decouple it from that. So again, regardless of what configuration mechanism you use, you can utilize that secret generation feature. So that will, so that approach, I think, will allow Kubernetes to sort of meet people where they are and use whatever configuration system works best for them, or that they have experience with, or, especially if they use something to configure resources outside of Kubernetes as well as inside Kubernetes, they can use a single mechanism for everything. So if you're interested in this topic, do get involved in the SIG, start discussion on the Google group. This discussion is pretty much done. So, the meetings are open for new topics in future meetings starting next week. So if you have a deployment or application configuration related issue that you want to discuss, that's a good place to discuss it. So.
Anybody have any questions for Brian about this or about Sig Config at the moment?
I guess one question would be that third-party config store. Do you guys have opinions on what it should be? I've heard people complain about is that 100,000 keys in key space or similar?
Using Kubernetes as config store, is that what you're asking?
Right.
Well, I think the number of configuration objects, I imagine, is going to be proportional to the number of Kubernetes objects, right? So if you have 10,000 services, you might have order 10,000, by some small constant factor number of configurations or something. So that doesn't seem that problematic. There is definitely a spectrum, and if things very large objects, like if you have configuration instantiated as Java jars or something like that, which may be tens of megabytes in size, those probably are not appropriate to store in Kubernetes. Those would probably be more appropriately pushed as Docker images. So that's another feature that we hope to add to the system, is the equivalent of sort of volumes from in Docker is the ability to mount an image as a volume into your container. So if you have a large configuration blob or basically data, like all the data from a website, something like that, like we have Git repo volumes for this reason. You can pull the data through that other means. So if you need to pull data from S3 or from Google Cloud Storage or from Git or wherever, you can either, or from a Docker registry, I want there to be a mechanism that makes that easy. It would not be the same as the kinds of configuration that I was talking about. And we do have a new config map API that is almost done and will be in 1.2 for small amounts of configuration data that can be easily injected into volumes and to environment variables, to decouple application configuration from pod configuration, which I think will be useful for a lot of use cases and enhance configuration reuse as well. But yeah, I mean, at some point you need to draw the line. So there's actually an active topic of discussion about what the size limit should be for these config map objects. And I expect us to add support to one of the quota mechanisms, like resource quota and or limit range, to allow administrators to decide what that size limit should be also.
640K.
So, yeah, and we have cases internally where people have ridiculous numbers of command line flags or environment variables or what have you, and at some point it becomes unmanageable. For some legacy applications that expect that, there's not much you can do. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis. I mean, some people want their clusters to scale to very large numbers of users, and those probably can't be as forgiving about the size of config objects, but smaller clusters, large config objects are probably fine. So I don't know, there's a one-size-fits-all answer.
I don't know that they're ever.
Practically speaking, etcd has a limit, though. I mean, etcd has a hard limit currently. I don't remember what it is, but at some point it just won't work.
Ideally, you fail gracefully, even if the answer is you should never do that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions for Brian around the Sig Config and what's going on with their conversations? Okay. I will presume that's a no, but I got a couple of questions privately about all the different SIGs and where you can find out more about the meetings and where you can find out more about what the conversations are. And most of the SIGs seem to have their discussions either in the mailing lists that exist, so you can search Google Groups for anything that begins Kubernetes-SIG, or in the Slack channel for each of the SIGs. And then, of course, many of them have regular meetings, which are negotiated on those mailing lists or in the Slack channel. So take a peek there for more ways to contribute. So we have, that was our Sig Config. We had a Sig Federation update on the Kubernetes Lite and Kubernetes design. I believe that would be Quentin, yes?
Actually, I think I'm going to give it.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
Quentin is leading our SIG, but there's a lot of community participation, so I'm going to give an update on where we are. By way of background first, We've nicknamed the effort to run federated clusters. We've called that Kubernetes. Quinton has a talk he gave at KubeCon, which gives a really good description of our plans from, I guess, a few months ago now. And that's on YouTube. I'm just going to put the link in chat, just in case, for the record. The big goal of our SIG is to be able to achieve sort of high availability Kubernetes setups that span the globe and all sorts of other cool things that you can see in that video. But in particular, we're talking about running multiple Kubernetes clusters in multiple zones or multiple regions, or even multiple clouds, getting into things like cloud bursting. We identified a sort of simpler use case, which is to run a single cluster in multiple zones, single cloud, and that's something where we've started, and we're calling that effort Kubernetes Lite, and we're working on that in parallel with the full multi-cluster federation effort, which we're calling Kubernetes. So I'll give you all a spoiler. We're still finalizing the design for Kubernetes Full, but we are planning on shipping Kubernetes Lite on AWS and GCE in 1.2. For Kubernetes Full, there's a design doc, which is 19313. And Huawei is leading the design and implementation of that. Kubernetes Full will start by adding an implementation of the Kubernetes API that will combine multiple clusters. So when you create an object in the Kubernetes API, it'll basically be farmed out to individual managed Kubernetes clusters. And the goal is to use the existing Kubernetes API, so you don't have to learn a new API, you don't have to reinvent all our tooling. And Huawei has a team actively working on this. And I will put a link in for that's the design doc for Kubernetes. On Kubernetes Lite, I thought I'd talk about what we're planning on shipping and not shipping in 1.2. So in 1.2, you will be able to add a set of nodes to an existing master, even if they're in another zone. When the nodes register, you may have already noticed on head that they add labels with their zone and region information. We've adapted the scheduler so that when you set up a replication controller, it will try to spread those pods across the zones, so you're not putting all your eggs in one basket or one zone. We've adapted the AWS and GCE cloud providers to be multi-zone aware where that was needed. And on AWS, there weren't a lot of changes needed, but on GCE, there's a feature flag you have to pass in, which I believe is called multi-zone in the kubeup script. The AWS stuff merged. The GCE PR should go in maybe today. We also have some volume awareness. So we have an emission controller that tags persistent volumes when you create them with their zone information. And then the scheduler will only schedule pods using those volumes onto nodes in the same zone, which solves the problem that on both GCE and AWS, you can't attach a volume to an instance in a different zone. AWS support is merged, and GCE should, again, go in this week. We've tested, and load balancers do work across zones, so that will just work out of the box. The master will remain a single point of failure, but we'll hopefully get to that in 1.3. And on both GCE and AWS now, we have added, or we now have the ability to sort of auto restart the master. So if it crashes, it'll at least be restarted by the cloud monitoring APIs. So that's what we're going to ship. That's Kubernetes Lite, a single cluster that can span multiple zones and makes reasonable decisions, I hope. We're not planning on building a whole lot more into Kubernetes Lite. We're not planning, for example, on building zone awareness into kube proxy. So that traffic might bounce around a fair bit inside your cluster. And if you want to run multi-region or multi-cloud, that's never going to be an Kubernetes Lite. That's where Kubernetes comes in. But for Kubernetes 1.2, we'll hopefully meet a lot of people's needs that do want to run multi-zone for some HA support, and come help us with Kubernetes so we can get it into 1.3.
A question on Kubernetes Lite?
Yes.
So what you're describing seems very sensible and useful. A near use case to that is if you're running in your own data center environment on bare metal, and perhaps you might even think of a rack as being a zone or something. Sounds like most of what you do would adapt to that pretty easily, but could you comment further?
Absolutely. So for that scenario, or for other clouds, if you add the same labels to your nodes, then the existing spreading spreading scheduler or spreading preference will work. So if you wanted to label, each of your racks with a different zone or whatever, however you want to allocate that, then yes, we will spread out across racks or however you decide to do it. The volume thing, again, if you have, like a SAN at the top of each rack or in each data center, then yes, you should probably tag that, or you'll have to do some, as long as if you tag your volumes, then, or your persistent volumes, then that will also work. If you want to automatically tag them, you have to go in and add some code so that when you create to the admission controller, so that when you create the persistent volume, you'll have to, query your internal environment. But as long as it's all controlled by labels. So as long as you add the labels, then everything should apply equivalently. And then any sort of customization to a different cloud provider or bare metal would be about just adding those labels automatically.
For those that don't know, what Bob is describing and what Justin is describing is how we in fact run at Google, where once you basically, anytime there's a significant difference in latency or performance or something like that between a given cluster, that's when you want to start having your cluster scheduler be aware of those kind of things. That's obviously coming in Kubernetes proper. In Kubernetes Lite, as long as your nodes have a tolerance of latency between them, and you can deal, exactly as Justin said, between ingress and egress, and there's no cost and things like that, then absolutely you could have node pools per rack, and that would work perfectly well.
Excellent. Thanks, Justin. And I think you're one of the people who makes Kubernetes go on AWS. So if anybody wants to work on that, Justin would be one of the people to reach out to, because he's done an enormous amount of work on that thus far. All right. If there are no further questions about Kubernetes, I'll give everybody a minute to check if they're on mute and asking questions. And then if not, we will run on to talking. We had a question last time about conformance tests and more broadly testing, but I don't think we can get into the more broad testing picture, because the testing and continuous deploy stuff is a different person. But we have Ike here, I will move the video, who has been working on the conformance testing, or is beginning to work on the conformance testing. And so I didn't track last time who asked questions about conformance tests, but I did bring Ike to answer them. So if you have further questions, or if there was something specific from last time and somebody wants to pipe up, that would be awesome.
The question was kind of driven towards, like, how do conformance tests factor into the release process, and what does the release process look like for 1.2? Like, just during the scalability SIG about an hour ago, somebody was talking about a code slush or code freeze, and that was sort of the first time I, as an outsider who's not a Googler, have heard about that. And maybe that's representative of me not being plugged in somewhere, but I just was sort of, maybe that's taking that out of scope of just conformance tests, but I think there was a plan to get conformance tests more tightly integrated into the release process, and I was kind of interested in it from that perspective.
Yeah, totally.
I was going to say, so conveniently, we also have TJ here, who does the TPMing and is going to do an update either later today or possibly next week, depending on timing, about the 1.2 release.
Yeah, TJ knows more specifics about the 1.2, but I can talk a little bit about where we are with conformance testing and also the sort of release process and what that looks like. So the conformance testing, we had some calls for revisiting that a month or two ago, and Aaron from Samsung and myself and Joe Beta and a couple of other folks sat down and sort of tried to hack out what we would like conformance testing to look like. And Aaron opened an issue. I have it open. It's issue 18.16.2.18162. Modify conformance test policy to use tests from release branches. And that represents a bit of a shift from, it's sort of he did a great job of outlining what we talked about and sort of where we need to go with that. For 1.0, we sort of said conformance tests were, version 1, and that was, going to be conformance testing for version 1. Looking back on that, we sort of decided that was probably not the right decision because it didn't allow us to move and change both to like fix tests and make them less brittle, which is an important thing as we're, trying to get new providers going and other kinds of things, but also add tests so that people can say not only my cluster is V1 conformant, but that it's V1.1 conformant or V1.2 conformant because it, factors in, it, has the ability to schedule jobs or other features that we've added thus far. So we do expect conformance tests to be forward compatible, but not backward compatible. So V1 conformance tests should work on a V1.2 cluster. V1.2 conformance tests should not work on a V1 cluster necessarily. V1.0 is what I mean when I say V1. That may or may not always be the case. Unfortunately, some tests, we realize were poorly written and we need to make them better. So we will be encouraging people to use conformance, the latest conformance tests. That said, also, we will also have the concept of conformance tests at head. They will move quicker because head moves quicker, or master, whatever you want to call it, moves quicker than a release branch. But, that is sort of what we expect to be passing as we're coming up to the 1.2 branch. We would like providers to be sort of watching their conformance against master to make sure that when we do that branch, there's not a last minute scramble to cherry pick a bunch of stuff into the release branch to make all the providers that we want conformant.
Are these conformance conversations and the PRs that you mentioned coming out of the SIG testing group, or you have not yet integrated with that?
So the SIG testing group hasn't been meeting as far as I know.
Right. Look at me trying to get this off the ground.
Yeah. So when I heard about these questions last week, I thought to myself, oh, we should, probably actually start scheduling SIG testing meetings. So if there is interest enough to make it worthwhile to schedule SIG testing meetings, I can certainly do that. I would love to start getting input from folks outside of Google. I know Carl KFI from Mesos and Aaron have both expressed some interest. I haven't heard explicitly we need more FaceTime with you all, but if that is the case, I'm happy to drive that.
Yeah, so this is Aaron asking a question. Thanks for really providing a lot of context there. And I do think we probably are at the point where some of the sausage making about how testing is actually implemented does need to be discussed at SIG testing, but I still am kind of curious for this audience. I do think Carl's done a lot of great work at backporting some of the new conformance test policy stuff into the release 1.1 branch. It's unclear to me if the work is going to continue back to the release 1.0 branch and maybe that legacy conformance test branch. So I was just kind of curious, since it does seem like we're converging towards a 1.2 release, how much of this conformance testing policy do we expect needs to be complete before the release, or how much of this is going to get kicked to 1.3?
Yeah, I would love to see it happen before the 1.2 release. I think, the limitation there is not do we want it to happen or not. The limitation is do we have the resources to make it happen in time or not. And, Aaron, you and I have both talked about this is high priority. It's just that there's a bunch of other stuff that's even higher priority. And
yes,
so
absolutely.
I think you and I are both in the same place on that. This has been something that I've been targeting for Q1. I don't know if it'll land before 1.2. I certainly hope that it will. But yeah, that's sort of where I'm at, is that I want to put resources toward it. I think we should, but there are many other things that also fall in that category.
So I'll use this opportunity to state that this should be the #1 priority for the entire project, and that the notion that there's all this feature stuff that needs lots of work and is higher priority. I know I've said this before, but I'm going to keep saying it. This should be the #1 project priority ahead of any feature addition, cool stuff, which I know attracts everybody's attention, but this is just too critical for it to be a second-class citizen.
Yeah, I'll second that as a user here. And if you need an anti-pattern to read up on and avoid, you could look at the binary compatibility issues that Scala has experienced version to version as real community killers and angry makers.
Cool. Well, both of those are really helpful. I can definitely take that back to the folks who allocate resources and say, hey, I need, the community is saying this is a huge priority for us. And, I think that is, what we need to make stuff happen and to drive that is people saying we need this. So
as one of the people with their finger on the button, so to speak, I also feel your pain and so on. I think that everyone here recognizes how quickly we've been moving, and there's some backfilling of software maturity that needs to go on, and we are invested in it from our side. We also very much want the community invested in it as well, and our brand new test lead and some other things will help with that. But I mean, you can argue that Sarah is pointing out of the work that Justin doing on AWS is a symptom of the same thing, right? Like, how do we formalize our testing around that and distribute it and all that good stuff? So this is an extremely high priority. We would love help from anyone as we build out this infrastructure and ask for a whole bunch of volunteers to help keep us honest.
David, that was exactly going to be my point. So, Salesforce and Samsung, do you have any coders that you would like to contribute to this high?
So let me say, we're putting our money where our mouth is on this. Pretty much, almost all what my team does is QA and testing related work. David, I think that was you commenting earlier. I think I certainly appreciate the nod towards the importance of testing, but I think when you actually start pulling people off of the feature projects that are going on and putting them directly on the QA stuff and making that the most important thing for us to have right for any release, then I think we'll have been at the right place. Be at the right place with it.
So I totally agree. I realize you don't see internal headcount allocation for Google, but there are full-time SWEs and test and folks working on this as we speak. Ike is just one, and there are others.
Great. We'd love to. I'd love to. I was just bugging Sarah about this earlier. We'd love to make this a priority in the community meetings, getting updates, and really making it a priority in this kind of community discussion as well. That would be great.
I share that sentiment. I think probably our #1 failing right now is we don't have a single artifact that we can share from. There's a lot of anecdote, like this works, this doesn't, this is broken. One of our top priorities is developing an artifact that everyone can have very clear awareness of what's working and what's not just at Google, but across the community.
And that's where I think this needs to dovetail into the SIG testing group for a little bit more discussion and filling it out.
Absolutely agree.
Not to discount, like there has been a lot of tremendous work by Ike and Carl and a bunch of other folks who I'm not naming. It's just this is a couple of guys who really just want to make their lives easier to make the releases go a little bit more smoothly. And I think what you guys are talking about is a longer term project that needs a team behind it.
Yeah. Well, and from our perspective, I want to Tai Chi that a tiny bit, Sarah. There should be no barriers to us giving back, and we've been clearing those internally. Reducing friction for contributing to open source, and the place where we'll really be able to help populate that kind of upper triangular matrix of version compatibility issues is as we bring more workloads onto Kubernetes internally, our integration testing pipelines will be producing bugs, and we'll be sharing those and trying our best to fix them ourselves as we go.
Fantastic.
Federated testing.
Yes, that is on the list.
My only other comment in this regard is that part of the other reason I'm being noisy about this is because I think this may relate to why the E2E submit queue is blocked. I asked about this last week and got an answer that was like, boy, we'd really love it if you could help out. But we think we've basically got it fixed at this point. And every time I've gone back to check on my PRs, they've always been blocked because of the E2E submit queue. It's kind of unclear to me, like, who do I ping? Where do I jump in to help out? Because it still seems like it's an issue. And again, I'm not sure what the date is for the supposed code freeze for the 1.2 release, but it seems like the submit queue is not moving at a high enough velocity to support that.
So concretely, just so people understand, there's a couple of different places you can go to look. If you look in the issues, every single test that is flaky has the flake mark on it. Many of them are marked P0. Any of those are fair game for people to go and take a look and try and fix. That's, the reason that the submit queue gets blocked up is because some of the tests are flaky. Now, there's also problems sometimes with that have to do with the specific details of the Jenkins boxes that we are running. Sometimes the care in feeding those Jenkins boxes is not perfect, and so that's something where sadly it's not really possible to take outside help. But anyone who wants to jump in and fix a flaky test, if they're looking to contribute, that's a great thing to do. And so and that is the cause for these things to run slowly. So and likewise, we will make sure that everything that is LGTM'd and ready to go in goes in before any sort of code happens, right? There's sort of a grandfathering of things that are in the queue. So I wouldn't worry. I mean, and trust me, it is a pain point that we are all feeling that we are actively working on. It is, as people who develop distributed systems know, it is a complicated thing to keep a large set of EDE tests running, of the system running green all the time.
And there is, so I'm build cop for yesterday and today, and I've been going through manually merging all the extra small one-liner changes to echo format stuff so that we reserve the submit queue bandwidth for bigger changes. We do have, obviously, I think a submit queue merge speed throughput issue that seems to happen every time code slush is a couple weeks away. So we'll have to come up with some ways to improve the process going forward.
And when Brendan says actively working on, literally in 4 minutes we have a meeting on this.
And I was also going to say, Justin, that Alex did merge while we were discussing your GCE support.
That was entirely coincidental. I didn't know who it was from.
All right, well, to David's point, we have 4 minutes, 3 now, and then we have our next meeting on just these things internally, and of course, I get the joy of sitting in that and always going, and how can we pull in more community members? How can they help you? So I will continue with that charge, and we will talk about the 1.2 release timeline more next week. I thought that is an item for the agenda, and I'm open for other items, other people who want to talk about how they're using Kubernetes or want to do demos of cool things they've done. So if there's anything else in the next 90 seconds, quick pipe up.
Hey, Sarah, can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Excellent. So just on the last topic, this is the Rackin team. We've been doing work to automate deployment on multiple platforms, actually to do a validation test. So we're doing work like this, but it doesn't involve the actual Kubernetes test suite. And if there's a company that wants to help with that work, the keyword for us, we're a tiny startup, so sponsor. But it's work that we were doing in the open to try and basically crank through a Jenkins-based full deploy pipeline and test. And so we'd love to be coordinating with some of the bigger names on this call who want to help build that infrastructure. We've already got a lot of pieces. So
it sounds like we really do need to pull the SIG testing group together and see who wants to push this forward.
Yeah, and I can definitely own that. you can reach out to me. It's IH McCreary at Google. You can also find me on GitHub.
Okay.
I typed up in that issue that I mentioned earlier. But I will. This is my word that I'll get a SIG testing group meeting sometime in the next week before we have the next community meeting. So.
Right.
Awesome.
And my part of my request is just if there are big companies who are trying to make this happen, we will certainly be happy to work with you from that perspective, but we could use help.
Cool.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I will see you all next week. Please add to the agenda. Thank you, Rob, for taking notes. I will reach out to some of you who I may need more clarity and notes from, and we'll get this week and next week's notes published. All right. See you all next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.